Welcome to Ethical Point. Today, we're diving into one of the most hotly debated, honestly kind of messy topics in global governance, and that's the ethics of international aid.
Right, because when rich nations send money or food to poorer nations, on the surface, it just looks like simple charity, doesn't it? But peel back the layers and you're suddenly looking at a massive theoretical battleground. We're talking global geopolitics, historical injustices, and a whole lot of hidden strings. Today, I'll be arguing from the recipient's reality while you take on the donor's perspective, and we're going to crack this debate wide open.
So let's jump right into the central mystery. This isn't just academic theory. This is literally the exact 10-marker prompt from the 2023 UPSC General Studies Paper 4. It asks you to comment on the ethics in contemporary international aid. And for the aspiring civil servants tuning in, this demands way more than just writing, helping people is a good thing. You need a really sharp, structured breakdown of the power dynamics at play. So we're going to solve this together today, taking you from the philosophical foundations straight into high-scoring exam strategy. Here's our quick roadmap for the episode. 1. Core theories. 2. Real-world ethical friction. 3. Emerging trends. 4. Equal partnership framework. And finally, 5. That all-important UPSC main strategy. All right, Section 1, Core Theories, the Theoretical Battleground. I'll kick things off with a donor-centric justification, which is deeply rooted in cosmopolitanism. So just a quick layman's definition here. Cosmopolitanism is essentially the idea that we're all citizens of one big global village. National borders, they simply don't matter when we're talking about basic human rights. This perspective argues that wealthy nations have a shared moral obligation to provide global public goods, like healthcare or climate protection, to everyone, period. It really frames international aid as this beautiful, selfless expression of global solidarity. And building right on top of that donor argument, we have utilitarianism. You know this one? It's the classic greatest good for the greatest number philosophy. From my angle, aid is a strict humanitarian duty. It's about protecting life and relieving suffering, especially during acute crises like a massive natural disaster. Plus, the utilitarian argument points out the practical benefits, right? By reducing extreme poverty, aid actually promotes global stability. It reduces desperate mass migration. It's basically a win-win for everyone. Okay, let me jump in right here because the recipient-focused viewpoint completely flips that script. Enter restorative justice. Instead of viewing aid as some generous act of charity, restorative justice argues that aid is, in reality, a form of reparations. In plain terms, it's about paying back a historical debt for past exploitation, like colonialism, or compensating for the massive environmental damage disproportionately caused by the developed world. From this viewpoint, aid isn't a gift at all. It's righting a historical wrong. Moving into Section 2, Real-World Ethical Friction. We need to define a crucial term before we go any further: strategic self-interest. This happens when donor nations prioritize their own diplomatic, commercial, or even military goals way over the actual humanitarian needs of the recipient.
Well, political realists would argue that governments have a primary duty to their own citizens, meaning any aid they give absolutely must yield some sort of national benefit.
Yeah, but critics argue that is deeply unethical. It transforms what should be selfless altruism into a heavily calculated weapon of soft power. But you have to consider donor-taxpayer accountability. Donor governments must answer to their taxpayers. That means they literally have to set strict conditions on how their money is used. And that completely undermines recipient sovereignty. These conditions often force devastating structural adjustments on the receiving nations. Take the International Monetary Fund, for example. Their funding routinely requires developing countries to adopt really specific economic reforms, like privatization. Historically, this has led to harsh, direct cuts in local healthcare and education. The recipient basically loses their sovereign right to make their own economic choices. And you know, this conditionality directly breeds paternalism. In layman's terms, paternalism is when donors treat recipient nations like children. The wealthy nations or massive international NGOs act as if they, and only they, know what is best. It's this top-down approach that completely overshadows local organizations. We have to remember, beneficiaries are rights holders. They aren't just passive targets for charity. Paternalism strips them of their dignity and completely ignores local expertise. We also face the real administrative dilemmas of tied aid and dependency. Tied aid is when funds are restricted, so the recipient is forced to buy goods and services only from the donor country.
Exactly. A highly debated example of this is Chinese developmental loans, like those in the China-Pakistani Economic Corridor. The labor and materials often come directly from China. Critics call this debt trap diplomacy, and it often leads to opaque contracting and elite capture.
Right, and then there's the dependency trap. Ethically, aid should aim to make itself obsolete, right? But look at Somalia. Local militias routinely intercept relief meant for displaced persons just to build their own power. It actually sustains the fighting and creates a vicious, endless cycle of dependency. All of this shows that political realism often ruthlessly overrides pure humanitarian need. Western countries have pledged over $380 billion in bilateral aid to Ukraine since 2022. Why? Because of its immense geopolitical and strategic value. Meanwhile, the $100 billion annual climate finance pledge, meant to support developing nations, which is a massive, urgent humanitarian necessity, routinely faces huge shortfalls. Need is simply ignored if there isn't a strategic benefit attached to it. That brings us to Section 3, Emerging Trends in Aid. A major paradigm shift happening right now is South-South cooperation. This refers to collaborative frameworks led by developing nations themselves, like India and Brazil.
And this is an area where we can definitely both agree. The core principle here is non-interference. Unlike traditional aid that comes with all those paternalistic strings attached, South-South cooperation promotes mutual benefit without dictating a country's domestic policy. Now, even though it currently faces some pretty significant funding limitations compared to Western aid, ethically speaking, it is a vastly more equitable model.
Now, here's a contemporary curveball for our debate: massive private philanthropy. Organizations like the Gates Foundation are injecting literally billions into global health. But ethically, this raises a massive red flag. Do these private entities actually make aid more efficient by bypassing all that bureaucratic red tape, or do they completely undermine sovereign state authority? I mean, when private individuals hold more financial power than the actual governments they're supposed to be helping, it severely complicates who is actually accountable to the local citizens. Let's look at solutions in Section 4, Equal Partnership Framework. Solving this friction requires a blueprint for aid that is sustainable, empowering, and fair.
Absolutely. We must shift away from paternalism and move toward true partnership. Aid has to be demand-driven with a heavy focus on local capacity building, rather than just slapping short-term band-aids onto deep systemic problems.
We have to avoid harmful conditionality and fix accountability. Donors and recipients need to be totally transparent with each other. Honestly, this is the only ethical way to ensure aid eventually makes itself obsolete. Finally, Section 5, UPSC Mains Answer Strategy. For the UPSC aspirants tuning in, if you want to immediately demonstrate critical, structured thinking to an examiner, utilize a comparison table in your answer.
Exactly. Contrast the theoretical ethical value with the contemporary reality. Show them that altruism is often masked as a tool for soft power.
Point out that accountability is totally inverted. Recipients are forced to answer to donors, not their own citizens. Highlight that sustainability is routinely replaced by short-term band-aids, and that equity is completely skewed by geopolitical alliances. Presenting complex information this cleanly, that is exactly what grabs marks. Here is your perfect 3-step structure for that 10 marker. Step 1, your intro. Cleanly define international aid as a voluntary transfer of resources, noting it's an expression of global solidarity. Step 2, the body. This is where you showcase the friction. Contrast those ethical foundations like cosmopolitanism with the messy realities of tied aid, paternalism, and loss of sovereignty. And approach up here, use handwritten style marginal notes in your exam for keywords like restorative justice or debt trap diplomacy to really make them pop off the page. Then step 3, your conclusion, the way forward. You absolutely must emphasize the shift from a donor-recipient hierarchy to an equal partnership. Which brings us to a really powerful quote you should memorize for your conclusion. Our goal shouldn't be less aid, but better, more ethical aid. We don't abandon global solidarity, we fix the system so it respects human dignity and builds real, lasting capacity. But ask yourself this as we sign off today. If your own country faced a massive crisis tomorrow, would you want international aid delivered as charity with conditional strings attached, or as a true partnership of equals? Thank you so much for joining us on Ethical Point. We'll see you next time.